Hello, I'm Karen Welch, and this is the Panhandle PBS studio, and you're watching 806ology. Thanks for coming along on a deeper dive into our community. Today, we're talking about zoning. It's the process that aims to keep a factory from being next to a house or a junkyard from being right next door, having businesses have enough parking spaces, things like that.
Right.
And I'm talking about that with AJ Fawver. She is the planning director for the city of Amarillo.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. We're about to, or there's a discussion going on with the city council about overhauling the zoning ordinance.
That's right.
That's a big job, but tell me, just give me the basic rundown of why.
Well, our current ordinance in its complete form has existed in whole or in part since 1960, and obviously our city's changed substantially since then. At the time of that zoning ordinance, the type of ordinance that we have in place was one that was very popular, but over the years, cities have started looking at different and innovative ways to sort of customize their zoning ordinances, and it's really about tying the rules to the end purpose that the community has in mind. And so for a city like us with a 2010 vision that we're trying to achieve, a tool from the 60s isn't exactly the best way to get there. And so that's kind of what prompted the conversation.
Okay. Give people a layman's understanding of zoning and why we need it, why we want it.
Sure. Well, the first examples you gave are the ones that most people think of. So this whole idea of separating uses that are not compatible, that's kind of the bottom line of what zoning is about. But there's other elements of it too that help shape a community. And so those are things like, for example, numerical standards that determine where on a lot your house needs to be set back to preserve space, to make sure that there's room for things like sidewalks and driveways. Zoning ordinances also look at performance standards, and what I mean by that is sort of those nuisance related things that we think about, like pollution and noise. Those kinds of nuisances are addressed often in a zoning ordinance. And really the contemporary part of a zoning ordinance is learning and using rules to make sure that construction that dates back to the early parts of a community can be reused in a way that makes sense. And so that's really kind of the missing element of the ordinance we have now, is that bridge between the past and how we make those things work for us as we're moving towards the future.
Okay. And you mentioned noise. I don't think a lot of people think of that as something that zoning does, but I recall several zoning questions at planning and zoning meetings regarding, say, music played on loudspeakers at car lots,
Right.
or how loud a drive-through microphone system is and how close that is to residences and things like that. Is
Sure.
that what we're talking about?
It is, and so that is not necessarily required to be part of a zoning ordinance. Some cities look at that through their general code of ordinances, but when you're talking about things, especially like an industrial type of use, it's very easy to say, here's kind of the base performance level that we'll accept, and anything that exceeds that requires either additional approval or discussion at some level.
Right. I remember even conversations about jackhammers, the air hammers at car tire places and things like that. You've been with the city how long now?
About 18 months.
Okay. What did you find as far as our zoning is concerned in that time? What does it look like, and why do we need the changes?
Well, to be honest with you, in terms of our greater West Texas region, we're really not that uncommon. The way that we currently look at zoning is the way a lot of West Texas cities look at zoning. But what we are starting to see is we're becoming more driven towards purpose and vision. And I think this council has really stepped up and exhibited their own desires to see that happen through the pillars that they've recently adopted. So we're talking a lot about where we want to end up and how we want to get there. But in order for us to get there, the staff has to have the tools that allow these things. And so things like a zoning ordinance are really important, not just because they help us set up an environment to make those things happen, but also because they set up an expectation of certainty for people. And so whether you are a property owner that has purchased a house somewhere, or you're a developer that your bread and butter is doing subdivisions or maybe doing some commercial development, or you're just a citizen, the thing that all of those people have in common is they want to have some expectation of certainty as to what's expected and what they can expect to be happening around them. Rules, anyone can follow the rules if they know what they are. And one thing that we can do a better job with this ordinance, I think, is being very clear about what the restrictions are, trying to simplify and make sure that our processes are not more complex than they need to be. And I think that's something, regardless of your vantage point, we can kind of all get around.
We've discussed for years, in all the years that I've been covering the city, the development processes, and always the developers, granted, want them to go faster.
Sure.
But will this help smooth some of those processes as far as developers beginning to plat their land, which means drawing kind of the lines and saying, here's what it is, and then moving into zoning to say, well, here's what we want to use it for. Will it help that?
Well, the subdivision ordinance is a separate piece, so those processes wouldn't be part of a zoning ordinance update, but there are a number of processes that would be encompassed within this update. And so that would cover, first of all, your zoning changes. Specific tools that we have, like the Plan Development District, there are other tools out there that this city doesn't use that are available to us. And so it's a good opportunity for us to say, what tools are we missing that make this a little simpler? There are also some conditional approval processes and variance processes outlined in this ordinance that need to be fine-tuned a little bit. Some of those are set for us through the state legislator, but there are certain things that we can do to kind of tweak those, or to set them up in a process that moves a little bit faster.
With the regard to the variances and the plan developments, explain what a plan development is.
So a plan development district, or we call it a PD district for short, it's a tool that emerged sort of in the mid-century time period when people were realizing that every category defined in a zoning ordinance might not cover everything. It also is an evolution of this understanding that mixed uses, like we saw in very historic downtowns where you had people living up top with a storefront down below, that's a very classic way of developing. The kind of ordinances that we have in place right now don't encourage it. In some places, they actually don't allow it. So the Plan Development District gives us an opportunity to say, based on the unique features of this site that make it something that's really not classifiable, we'll create a custom zoning ordinance for that site. It also allows the city to put conditions in place which help mitigate any issues. So for example, that could include things like landscaping requirements to mitigate sound and sight barriers. It could include things like design standards because it's in a historic neighborhood so that it fits the character of the neighborhood. It gives us a lot of flexibility. But it's not the right tool for everything. There are lots of uses predefined in the ordinance that work as they are. So it's sort of that tool that fills the gap when we have that issue.
And we have a lot of plan developments. So
we have more than most cities our size. It's something we're actually looking at right now. One thing about a plan development district is it does require a site plan to be codified. And so when you're making changes to that, it's an ordinance change.
Right.
So one thing that we're trying to do now with our staff is kind of steer people in the right direction once we understand what they're trying to do. If that's not in their best interests, we're not going to suggest that tool. But if it's something that's maybe a campus style development with lots of different uses, for example, we might recommend that and work through that process with them. So we're really trying to focus right now on helping people apply the right tool in the right situation.
Okay, and so theoretically, when a zoning ordinance is overhauled, you'll have many more tools to rely on rather than just offering them a plan development or saying this is how you have to do it.
Absolutely.
What kind of tools would be out there that we could use?
Well, there's about 6 or 7 major categories of zoning ordinances if you were to try to categorize them very easily. So the zoning ordinance that we have in place right now is what we would call a Euclidean or a pyramid zoning district ordinance. And we call it that because it's done sort of sequentially. And by that I mean a light commercial district would allow everything that a general retail commercial district allows and a little more. Then you would move up to a heavy commercial, which would allow everything in light commercial and a little more. And so it bumps up in intensity. And so that's why a pyramid is sometimes a reason that that's called that. However, there are many other types. Some cities use what they call a performance zoning approach, which is focused more on numerical standards. that establish sort of the layout of how things should fit in the environment. That's usually used more, not citywide, but maybe in a district that they're trying to do specific kind of redevelopment in.
Like a historical
historic
district, or an industry
a business
park,
district.
industrial park,
That's
or
a good
something
example
like
as well.
that? Okay.
There's also a type of zoning called incentive zoning, which gives some latitude in the minimum requirements and lets you actually exceed those at times if you can show that there's a greater benefit to the area. And so that's used, for example, in some of the Midwest states. That's kind of their approach to doing that. What's really popular right now and seems to be fairly effective is what we call a form-based code. And that is really, just as it sounds, its focus is the forms of the buildings and not the uses. And so there's more latitude in putting uses together so long as the buildings are designed in such a way that it is uniform in keeping with the area around it. You see these a lot in special corridor districts, downtown districts. And to be really frank, what we're seeing more of in the field is cities using what we call hybrid codes, which takes some of the features of some of or all of those different types and mixes it together based on what the community is trying to achieve.
So one thing we are trying to achieve in Amarillo is to infill, especially in downtown. And infill means take a site that was already there and make it useful again.
Right.
And so, how would a zoning ordinance overhaul help that?
Well, what most people forget about ordinances in general is that it's not only a tool that regulates or mandates behavior, it can also be a tool that encourages or incentivizes behavior. And so that's the direction that I think we would suggest going in. So having a zoning ordinance in this case, when we're trying to look at infill development, that gives some latitude to minimum lot sizes, that gives some latitude to infrastructure improvements or upgrades, things that make it easier to say, I'm going to redevelop this parcel instead of heading out to where there's raw land.
Right.
We can do that with this tool. The current tool doesn't get us there, but it is something that a zoning ordinance can be used to do.
Okay. I know one of the things that you said we're limited on right now is that we have height restrictions in place that keep us from going up as much as maybe we might rather than out.
Right.
And that's important because people talk about urban sprawl, they talk about spreading resources and streets and utilities out to the edges of a community. What would change there if it was looked at?
I think it would be a combination of looking at things like height and also looking at things like density allowances, setbacks, things that force people to spread out rather than move up.
Right.
Obviously, density, as you mentioned, is more affordable for us as a city. It also, studies have shown that it holds its value longer in many instances. So there's a lot of advantages to making that possible.
And by density, we're talking more people accommodated on a certain piece of property.
That's correct. Right? That's correct. So, for example, instead of building right in the center of a lot, being able to spread out further, have the parking maybe in the rear, or building up. So allowing you to have more square footage per lot, which means, of course, correlates to your tax dollars, making more money for the city per parcel as well.
And I should have said, if anyone has questions out there, that happens to be watching, post them on our Facebook Live, and we'll try to get them answered. But tell me, what is the process for this then?
So one of the first things that we would need to do is to work with our internal team and our council to put together a scope of services that define what it is that we're looking for, what we're looking to achieve with this tool. That tool would then be published so that different consultant teams that would be interested in serving that can submit what we call their qualifications. So this would be a request for qualifications. Once we have that period of time closed, we can review what we have. We can select through a committee. There would be a selection committee, the selected consultant or consultant team, and then work with them on negotiating both a contract and, of course, a price for the work. The typical timeline for something like this can be between 6 and 12 months. However, because we've waited so long to do this and it's sort of a huge overhaul, it would be probably more of an 18 to 24 month period of time. So it's a pretty substantial undertaking. But of course, we know that with our current council and our current leadership, you know, engagement is very important. So we need to make sure that we have the right people at the table, that we involve stakeholders from different groups, and that of course takes time.
Presumably like developers,
The
real
development
estate.
community, the real estate community,
and residents.
citizens,
Yeah.
residents, business owners. I mean, everyone really has a vested interest in this, whether or not that's in the forefront of their mind.
Okay. What do we think the cost would be?
So again, based kind of on the time that we've gone without updating this, preliminarily we're hearing that this would be probably between 200 and 300,000. It would probably be a 2-year contract.
And then how often or how would it be updated? You know, when we've done this, then how do we keep it from being another 60 years?
Keeping it fresh.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got to keep it fresh. So there's different levels of updates that we would do from then on. Best practices really is once a year, for example, we would monitor things like requests for variances. When you're receiving requests for variances from the same standards over and over, it's a good indicator that that's not working for your community. And so that would be something we would monitor on an annual basis. We'd probably look at doing some tweaks to it every probably 5 to 6 years. And then really it would be in our best interest to do an update, say every 7 to 10 years.
And requests for variances, those go before the Zoning Board of Adjustment ultimately.
That's correct, yes.
Another citizen appointed board, or council appointed board. Those requests for variances are things like fence setbacks or lot line, lot width.
Right.
Or
parking spaces, that's a big one.
Back alley waivers, things like that.
Right.
Okay. So you're seeing a lot of people wanting to approach development in a different way, and we have a lot of variances that seem like they're going through.
I wouldn't say we have a lot. I'm actually surprised at the number that we have given the age of the tool. But again, I think the product that we're seeing is not necessarily what people generally visualize when they come in to talk to us. And so I think we could help them visualize and execute their vision a little bit better if the tools were more contemporary. So I think it's a benefit both for people designing projects that have an idea in their head of what they want to accomplish, and it also allows us to have something that's a little more of a modern element in our city. And so I think it will give more freedom to those people that are trying to do some development and allow us to be more responsive to their ideas.
Okay. Okay. There's a big plan that's being introduced, the final draft, I guess, of the Barrio Neighborhood Plan.
Yes.
If you want to go and hear about that, the plan will be introduced to the community in a meeting on Monday the 26th from 5:30 to 6:30. That's at Wesley Community Center in the gymnasium at 1615 South Roberts. What should people expect? What are we talking about?
So it's going to be an open house style meeting. We will have several different sections set up around the gymnasium that correlate with sections of the plan. And so we're there to both show off the work that's been done by us with the committee that we've been working with, and also to get feedback, any insights on things that we may have overlooked. Really, this is our last chance to tighten everything up before we present it for adoption to the City Council and the Commissioner's Court.
And what kinds of things does that cover?
So for this particular plan, there's 6 different areas that we're looking at. They focus on things like non-residential and residential development and maintenance, stimulating infill, like you mentioned earlier. We also are going to be looking at neighborhood health as a whole, neighborhood safety, the infrastructure in that area, and then the amenities and identity of the neighborhood, kind of preserving that and capturing that for the future.
And this is not the first of these neighborhood plans the city has done.
This is the second. The first was our North Heights neighborhood plan that was adopted by the council in January of last year.
Okay. The idea being that these are kind of areas that have that need a boost in planning and a look at how to bring them forward?
Yes, it's actually very similar to what we're talking about today, because it's understanding that what we've been doing isn't working for those areas and we need to customize our approach. And so each of these plans represents a capsule of the comprehensive plan that's customized for that area, what makes that area unique based on the data that we've collected, based on the study that we've done, and based on the neighborhood that we've talked with.
Okay. AJ Fawver, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.